Those savings bonds were never really yours, sweetheart. He just put your name on them to be sweet. My mother said that over my grandfather's casket. We'd buried him that morning. I'm the granddaughter Walter raised, and she'd already quietly cashed 7 of the bonds he left in my name, lying to a teller to do it. Then she patted my hand like the matter was closed. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I reached into my purse. Inside was a manila envelope, soft at the corners. Inside it, the original United States Treasury savings bond certificate filled out in my grandfather's own hand 18 years before, dated, serial numbers down the side, one name typed in the box marked registered owner. A federal record. My mother had no idea it still existed. She thought it went into the ground with the man, and she was so sure she'd won that she said it twice. Sit where I can see you. This one matters. I save these for the nights the house is too quiet, for when the people who were supposed to love you most leave a silence shaped like them. So tell me, if your mother stood over the casket of the man who raised you and said his last gift was never yours, would your voice have stayed level? Mine did. Now, let me tell you how it began. Let me back up, because you have to understand the shape of us first, or none of it lands the way it should. My grandfather raised me as much as anyone did. My mother had me young and angry, and she spent my childhood chasing a version of her life that never had room in it for a kid. So I got handed off, summers and weekends, and a lot of the in-between, to her father. His name was Walter, and he was the steadiest man I have ever stood next to. He kept his shoes shined and his word kept, and he had a way of looking at you like you were worth the looking. He fixed lawnmowers in a garage that smelled like oil and cut grass, and he had a metal box on the top shelf of that garage, gray with a little key. And inside it, he kept the things he thought mattered. I didn't know yet that I was in that box. I want to give you one small picture because it tells you everything about him. When I was about 9, I'd done something at school. Won a little ribbon for a spelling thing, nothing, a scrap of paper really, and my mother had forgotten the assembly. Forgotten clean. And Walter, who had not been told, who had no reason to be there, walked into the back of that gymnasium in his work clothes, with grass still on his boots, because somebody at the diner had mentioned it to him, and he stood in the back, and he clapped like I'd cured something. After, he took me for a root beer float, and he said, "I'll always know where you are, kiddo. You don't have to wonder about that." And he meant it as a promise, and he kept it the way he kept everything. That's the man my mother was talking about over his own casket, when she told me his gift to me was never mine. I want to give you one more picture, because the first one shows you his heart, and this one shows you his hands, and you'll need both before the end. When I was small, maybe 5, he took me with him to the bank on a Saturday morning to buy one of those bonds, and I remember it the way you remember the smell of a place more than the shape of it, the cold air, the velvet rope, the pen on a little chain. He set me up on the high counter so I could see, and he filled out the registration in front of the teller in that careful block hand of his, and the teller, a heavy-set man with reading glasses, pushed up on his forehead, asked, "And whose name's going on it, Walt?" And my grandfather didn't even look up. He just tapped the box with the pen and said, "Hers, always hers." Like it was the most ordinary fact in the world. Then he had the man stamp it, and he folded the receipt into his breast pocket where he kept the things he meant to keep. And on the way out, he bought me a pack of crackers from a machine and told me not to tell my grandmother he'd spoiled my lunch. I thought we were getting away with something. We were. It just took 18 years for me to find out what. So you understand, the bonds weren't about money to me. They never were. Here is how they came to exist, and I want you to notice how quiet it was, because nobody armed me. Walter armed me, one small certificate at a time, and then we both forgot about it. When I was 4 years old, Walter started buying United States savings bonds in my name. The old paper kind, the ones you bought at the bank for half their face value and waited 20 years for them to grow up. He bought them for birthdays instead of toys, a few here and there over the years, and on each one he filled out the registration by hand and typed in the owner. He'd show me sometimes when I was small, and I didn't understand any of it. I just liked the eagle on them and the serious look on his face. "This is you when you're grown," he'd say, tapping the box with my name in it. "This is so. You've always got a floor under you." Then he'd lock them back in the gray box on the top shelf. And he did one thing more, though I wouldn't understand the weight of it for years. The big certificate, the master registration, the one that listed the whole line of them, the serial numbers, the owner of record, he didn't keep that one with the bonds. He told me once, almost offhand, while he was wiping down a carburetor, "The smart thing about important paper is you never keep it all in one nest, kiddo. You keep a copy where a thief would look, and the real one where they wouldn't." I thought he was talking about lawnmower receipts. He wasn't. He was telling me, 12 years early, exactly why his daughter's key would one day open an empty kind of victory. I forgot about that box for years. You do. You grow up, you move out, life gets loud. But Walter never forgot, and that turned out to matter more than anything. Now, let me tell you about my mother, because if I just call her a villain, you'll picture something cartoonish. And the real thing was so much smaller and so much worse. Her name is Diane. She is not a monster. She is a woman who has spent her whole life feeling like the world owed her a balance. It never paid, and so she collects what she figures she's owed wherever she can reach it, and she has a genuine, frightening talent for believing her own version. By the time the words leave her mouth. She loved her father in her way. She also resented, for 50 years, that he was steady and she was not. That people trusted him and circled wide around her. And somewhere in that resentment, she'd decided that anything of his was really, fundamentally hers. That I was just a placeholder he'd used to needle her. By the time she said those bonds were never mine, she believed it all the way down. That's the part that chills me still. She wasn't lying to me. She'd lied to herself first, years before, and made it true on the inside. She had a sister too, and you should hold on to her, because she matters later. My Aunt Marlene, Walter's younger daughter, Diane's only sibling, was the soft one, the one who kept the peace by never quite taking a side. Where Diane pushed, Marlene smoothed. She'd spent her whole life half apologizing for her sister, the way some people do for a dog that bites, and she'd learned that the cheapest path through any family storm was to agree with whoever was loudest in the room. I tell you this now so that later, when everything hangs on which way one frightened, decent, exhausted woman decides to lean, you'll understand it was never going to be simple. Walter's health went the way it goes. The heart first, then the slow fog. In his last 2 years, I drove out most Sundays and sat with him in the garage even after he couldn't fix anything anymore, and we'd just sit. And it was on one of those Sundays, maybe 8 months before the end, that he reached up, slow, both hands, and brought down the gray box and set it in my lap. He gave me the little key. "When the time comes," he said, "this is the part of me that's just yours. Your mother's going to have feelings about it. Let her have her feelings. But this is yours, and I did it right, in writing, so nobody can talk you out of it." I didn't want to take it. Taking it felt like agreeing he was leaving. He closed my fingers around the key with both of his hands, and he said, "I'll always know where you are, kiddo." The same words, the last promise, folded inside the first. I took the box home. I opened it that night at my kitchen table, and there they were, a small stack of paper bonds and one larger certificate, The original registration, every one of them with my name typed in the owner's box in his careful hand. I put them in a manila envelope, and I put the envelope in a drawer. And I cried, and I did not think of them as a weapon. They were just the last warm thing he'd left on for me, the way some people leave a porch light. I had no idea I was keeping evidence. Here's what I didn't know that night. My mother had a key too. Now let the months turn, because this is where it gets cold. Walter passed on a gray Tuesday in March, with the last of the snow going to mud. I held his hand. I was the one there, because I was always the one there. And grief in a family like mine has a cruel second act. The moment the casket closes, the arithmetic starts. I could feel it start before we'd even left the hospital. My mother cried the loud kind of crying that's really about being seen crying, and in the same breath, she was already talking about settling things, about how there's going to be a lot to sort out. And I remember thinking, the man isn't even cold, and the sorting has begun. I want to name the small knives from those weeks, one at a time, because the cruelty of this kind of family is almost never loud. It comes as logistics. The first knife came 2 days after he died, and it came as a kindness, which is how the worst ones always come. My mother called and said, sweet as Sunday, that she'd take care of the obituary. You've got enough on your plate. I let her because I was hollowed out and grateful for one less thing. The obituary ran in the county paper that Friday. It listed Walter as the beloved father of Diane and the dear brother of names I half knew, and it named Diane's church and Diane's children's children. And at the very bottom, almost as an afterthought, and is survived by extended family. Extended family. 18 years of Sundays in that garage, and the man who clapped at the back of a gymnasium with grass on his boots, and I was extended family. She hadn't forgotten me. She'd done it on purpose, the way you'd erase a pencil line you didn't like. Quietly, completely, leaving just enough smudge that you couldn't prove it had ever been there. I read it standing at my mailbox, and I felt the first cold draft of what she thought I was worth. And I said nothing because I didn't have the words yet. I just had the draft of cold air and the start of understanding what she was capable of doing to a record. The second knife was the tools. Walter's garage was the cathedral of his life. The wall of wrenches hung in order of size, the bench worn pale where his forearms had rested for 40 years, the coffee can of cotter pins he'd never once needed, but never once thrown out. The Saturday after the funeral, before the ground had even settled, my mother held a yard sale. She didn't tell me. A neighbor did, a man named Hollis, whose mower Walter had kept alive for a decade, and the way Hollis told me, embarrassed, looking at his shoes, was that he'd gone over to buy back the very mower he'd given Walter to fix because he couldn't stand to see it on a folding table with a masking tape price on the handle, $3. She'd priced the wall of wrenches at $3 apiece and sold the bench to a stranger for $40 and put the coffee can of cotter pins out in a free box. I drove over when Hollis told me, and the garage was already a shell. The pale-worn spot on the bench gone out the driveway in the back of a pickup, and my mother was counting bills at the card table with a cigarette. She didn't usually let herself have, and she looked up at me and said, "Don't start. It was just junk. Somebody had to deal with it." Just junk. The same 2 words she'd use weeks later about the gray box. I should have heard the rehearsal in it. I was too busy looking at the empty hooks on the wall. And here is the mini reveal. The thing I pieced together standing in that emptied garage. Because it changed the shape of everything that came after. The gray box was gone. The top shelf where it had lived for as long as I'd been alive was bare. A clean rectangle in the dust where it had sat. She'd been here. She'd been here before the yard sale, before the obituary, maybe before the funeral flowers had even wilted, and she'd taken the one thing in that garage she actually wanted and left the rest for $3 a wrench. And I knew, the way you know a thing in your stomach before your head catches up, that she hadn't taken it for sentiment. You don't sell a man's wedding-worn workbench for $40 and keep a junk box for love. She'd taken it because she knew what was in it. She'd known for years. And the only reason I wasn't sick to my knees right then was the small, warm fact sitting in a drawer in my kitchen. The certificate she didn't know I had, because Walter never kept it all in one nest. The third knife came at the cemetery office, and it was the one that told me she wasn't grieving him at all. She was managing him. The headstone. Walter had told me once, on one of those Sunday afternoons in the garage, exactly what he wanted on it. Nothing fancy. His name, his dates, and under it, the words, "He kept his word." 5 plain words. He'd said them looking at the wall of wrenches, half smiling, like a man who'd already made his peace with the size of his life. So when the cemetery called me, by accident, because my number was still on an old form, asking me to confirm the inscription before they cut the stone, I drove down expecting his 5 words. And the woman behind the desk slid the order across the counter, and it read, "Beloved Father, forever in our hearts." Generic greeting card. The kind of thing you order when you've never once sat in a garage and listened to a man tell you who he was. Diane had filled it out. She'd had the chance to cut his own words into granite, and she'd reached past them for something that was really about her, the bereaved daughter, the one in the front pew. I asked the woman, very quietly, if it was too late to change one line. She looked at the order, and she looked at me, and she said the family contact had signed off, and only the family contact could change it. And I stood at that counter and understood that even on his stone, even in the one place his own words should have outlasted everyone, my mother had quietly written herself in over him. I'll tell you now so it doesn't sit on your chest the rest of this story. It isn't too late, and I did fix it after. His 5 words are on it today. But that afternoon, I drove home with my hand shaking on the wheel. And I want to be honest with you about what was in me, because I think you felt it too. Here is what I sat with, alone, at my kitchen table that night, with the certificate out of the drawer and flat in front of me under the kitchen light. I am not a vengeful person. I have spent my whole life being the quiet one, the level-headed one, the one who lets things go because letting go was the only way to survive a mother like mine. And there is a particular kind of grief that has no tears in it. It's drier than that. It's a low electric hum behind the eyes that comes when you realize the person who hurt you is not going to feel a thing. She would sleep fine. She would tell the story her way at the next family dinner and believe it. The unfairness of that, the sheer arithmetic of how much he loved and how little it would cost her, sat on me like a stone on the chest, and I understood for the first time why people burn things down. I ran my thumb over his careful typing, the slightly crooked second line where the old machine's ribbon had skipped, and I could see his hands doing it, the reading glasses, the concentration, and I thought, he did this so I wouldn't have to be loud. He did the loud part 18 years ago, in silence, in ink, so that I could stay myself. The least I could do was not become her to beat her. That's the night I decided it would be a door, and not a fire. But I want you to know the fire was real, and I chose past it. Anyone who tells you the quiet way is easy has never once held the match. She'd been in the garage. She knew exactly what was in that box, because she had her own key from years back, and somewhere in those first raw weeks, she'd taken the paper bonds that had matured, and she'd walked into a bank and cashed 7 of them. 7, in her own name, by lying to a teller about being the custodian, because the teller was looking at a grieving daughter and not at the registration. She thought the originals were gone with the man. She did not know I already had the master certificate at home in a drawer, the one Walter handed me himself 8 months before, the registration document that named the true owner of every bond he ever bought me. I found out the way you find out most true things. By accident. A cousin of mine, who banks at the same branch, mentioned to me in a low, careful voice at a family thing that she'd seen my mother at the counter, cashing in some of Walter's bonds, getting things in order, good for her, somebody's got to. Getting things in order. I smiled and said something pleasant, and went out to my car and sat there with my hands on the wheel and felt the floor that my grandfather had spent 18 years building under me get pulled out an inch at a time. I want to stop here and let myself feel it all the way down. With you, just for a second, because rushing past the hurt is how you let it own you. It wasn't the money. I need you to understand that, because if you think this is about the money, you'll miss the whole wound. It was that she took the one thing he made sure couldn't be taken. He did it right. He did it in writing, by hand, with the United States government as his witness, specifically so that no one could ever talk me out of being remembered by him. And she walked into a bank and undid his last careful act of love with a lie at a counter. And then she had the nerve, 8 days later, over his casket, to lean across and tell me it was never mine to begin with. She wasn't just stealing money. She was reaching into the grave and editing what my grandfather had said. She was trying to make his last promise into her property. And if you've ever watched someone rewrite a love you know was real, just because they couldn't stand that it wasn't aimed at them, you feel this in your chest right now, and I see you. Stay with me. The certificate is about to speak. But it doesn't speak yet, because there was one more person in this story. And the worst night of that whole month wasn't the obituary or the garage. It was the phone call from Marlene. My aunt called me the Tuesday before the funeral, and at first I thought, here's an ally. Here's one soft voice in all this. She cried with me about Walter. Real tears, the kind Diane didn't have. She told me a story about him teaching her to drive a stick shift in that same garage and stalling out laughing. And then, the way a tired person edges toward the thing they actually called to say. She got quiet and she said, "Honey, your mother came to me. She's saying there's money your grandpa left, bonds, and that she's the executor of it, and that you've been," her word, "circling." She asked me to back her up, to tell people, if it comes up, that Daddy meant for her to handle everything. And I felt the floor go again, because here it was. Diane wasn't just stealing the bonds, she was recruiting witnesses, building the version of the story she'd believe by the time she said it out loud, and she'd gone to the one other person whose word the church people would trust. And Marlene. God help her, she was so tired and Diane was so loud, and the path of least resistance was to just say yes and keep the peace one more time the way she always had. So I asked her gently, "Aunt Marlene, do you think that's what he meant?" And there was a long silence on that line, a silence with a whole life of being the peacemaker in it, and she finally said, "I don't know, honey. I don't know what he meant. I just don't want a war." And then she said the thing that told me she was already half gone to Diane's side. "Maybe it's easiest if you just let her handle it. He's gone. Is it worth the family over some bonds?" I didn't argue with her. I'd learned a long time ago that you can't win a tired person to your side by pushing. You can only leave the door open and hope. So I said, "I hear you. I'm not going to make a war, Aunt Marlene. I just want what's true to stay true." And I hung up not knowing which way she'd lean, and that not knowing followed me all the way to the church, because if Marlene stood up at that repast and said Daddy meant for Diane to handle it, then it would be my drawer paper against 2 grieving daughters in good black dresses, and you know which way a church room leans when it's outnumbered like that. That was the second loop I carried into that hall, the one nobody watching could see. Not just would the certificate speak, but would the one person who could corroborate me, or bury me, hold her nerve. Now, the wake. Walter wanted a church send-off and a repast in the hall after. The folding tables, the coffee urn, the casseroles, the whole worn and beautiful ritual of it. And the people came. Real people, the diner men, the neighbors whose mowers he'd fixed for free, the deacon who'd known him 40 years. That matters, because my mother had built her whole life on the church voice, on being seen as the dutiful daughter in the good black dress, and she had never once imagined that the room where she performed that role would become the room where the record got read out loud. The days before that repast were their own kind of theater. My mother called me twice. The first call she was warmer than she'd been in years, talking about how we needed to keep things peaceful, and how Walter wouldn't want any fighting, and how I'd always been the level-headed one. She was softening the ground. The second call, she let a little steel show. "I handled his accounts," she said. "You don't need to be worrying about any of that. You've got your own life. The bonds and such, those are settled. Those are settled, like a door clicking shut." And I said, very evenly, "Okay, Mom, I'll see you at the hall." And I could hear her take that as a yes. People who have never once been told no by you read your quiet as consent. It usually is. That was the last time it would be. The night before, I almost left the envelope home. I stood at my kitchen counter with it in my hand, and I thought, don't. Just go and grieve him and let it be. Don't make his funeral the place this happens. And then I thought about his hands closing my fingers around that little key. I did it right, in writing, so nobody can talk you out of it. And I understood that leaving the certificate in the drawer wasn't peace. It was just letting her win, quietly, letting his last promise be cashed out at a teller's counter and erased. So I put the manila envelope in my purse, and I drove to the church. I got there early, and the first thing I did was look for Marlene, because I needed to read her face before the room filled. I found her by the coffee urn, fussing with the casseroles, and she looked up at me with eyes that had been crying, and underneath the crying was something I couldn't name. Guilt, maybe, or the particular misery of a person who has agreed to do something she knows is wrong. Diane was across the hall, already holding court, already in the good black dress with the church voice on, and I saw her glance over at the two of us by the urn, and I saw something pass between the sisters. A look, a small nod from Diane that said, "Remember what we talked about." And Marlene dropped her eyes. And I thought, that's it then. She's going to back her. I have a drawer paper and a dead man's handwriting, and Diane has her sister and a room that loves a tidy daughter. I took my coffee to a folding chair, and I sat with the envelope in my purse, and I did the hardest thing I know how to do, which is wait quietly while the floor decides whether to hold. I want to tell you exactly how it happened, because it was so quiet, and quiet is the whole register of who I am. The repast was winding into its soft middle when she did it. People had eaten, the room had that low murmur of folks telling Walter stories, and the deacon, a kind, deliberate man named Brother Ames, who had buried half that congregation, was moving table to table with his coffee. The way he did, gathering people into a few words before they went home. My mother came around to where I was sitting with a paper plate I hadn't touched, and she sat down beside me, close, and she put her hand over mine on the table in a gesture that from across the room looked like comfort. And she leaned in, with her church voice turned all the way down to private, and she said it. "Those savings bonds were never really yours, sweetheart. He just put your name on them to be sweet. I've taken care of them. It's what he'd want, family helping family. So we don't need to ever talk about it again." Family helping family, over his casket spray. And then she patted my hand and started to lift hers away. The matter closed, the way she'd closed every matter my whole life. I want you to sit in that with me for one breath, because that sentence is the entire story. She had decided, in the warm certainty of a woman who has never once paid for the thing she's claiming, that my name on those bonds meant nothing, that I was a placeholder, furniture he'd used to needle her. And the beautiful, terrible truth, folded in the envelope in my purse, was that mine was the only name that had ever been on them at all. In his hand, in writing, for 18 years. So here's what I did. I did not pull my hand away. I did not raise my voice. I have never once made this loud. I make it quiet, because quiet is the only thing she could never argue with. I turned my hand over under hers, gently, so for a moment we were almost holding hands, and I said, "Okay, Mom, but before we never talk about it again, I want Brother Ames to see something. For Grandpa." And I lifted my hand out from under hers, and I reached into my purse. And here is where the room tilted, where the whole month came to a point, because everything depended on the next 30 seconds, and not one person watching knew it. My mother's face flickered. Just for a second, a hairline crack in the church mask, and she said, "Too quick, too bright. Marlene, come here. Tell her what Daddy wanted." And the whole hall sort of turned, the way a room does when a name is called across it, and there was my aunt, frozen by the coffee urn, with a casserole spoon in her hand. And Diane's eyes were on her, and the room's eyes were on her, and I felt my own breath stop, because this was the second loop closing. This was the witness either holding or breaking. Marlene looked at her sister. She looked at me. She looked for a long second at the manila envelope already half out of my purse, soft at the corners, my grandfather's envelope, and something crossed her tired face. I think it was the memory of a man teaching her to drive a stick shift in a garage and stalling out laughing. And she set the spoon down, slowly, and she said, into the quiet, in a voice that shook but did not stop, "Diane, I don't think we should talk for Daddy when Daddy wrote it down himself. She didn't take my side. She took his, and that was enough. That was everything." The hall didn't go silent all at once. It went silent in a wave, the way a room does when it senses something true is happening, the murmur dropping table by table until you could hear the coffee urn. I took out the manila envelope, soft at the corners, and I slid out the certificate. The original, the eagle on it, my grandfather's careful typing, and I smoothed it flat on the folding table with the side of my hand, the way you smooth a tablecloth. And I felt every eye in that room land on the paper, and I felt my mother go very still beside me, the kind of still a person goes when some animal part of them has understood the trap before the rest of them has, and I made myself breathe slow. One breath, because I had waited 18 years for this paper to be read, and I was not going to rush the last 10 feet of it. Brother Ames, who was right there with his coffee, looked down at it, because a document set deliberately in front of a deacon at a wake is a thing a good man stops for. And I said, in a voice I kept very level, "Brother Ames, my grandfather filled this out by hand. Would you read out the line that says who it belongs to? Just that line. I think he'd want it read by you." He didn't pick it up right away. That's the thing I remember most. The slowness of it, the way the whole room had to wait through it. He set his coffee down on the next table over. He reached into his breast pocket, and he took out his glasses, and he opened them with 2 hands and put them on, and the hall held its breath through every second of it, and my mother's hand, the one that had patted mine, had curled into the tablecloth. The coffee urn ticked, somebody's chair creaked and went still. And Brother Ames bent over the certificate the way that man bent over everything, carefully, with respect, and he found the line. And the silence in that hall was so complete that when he drew the first breath to read, I heard it. He read out loud into that quiet church hall. He read the box marked "Registered Owner," and the name in it was mine. My full name, typed by Walter's own hand 18 years before, with the date, with the serial numbers running down the side, a federal record that does not bend to a church voice. And then Brother Ames, who had known my grandfather 40 years and knew exactly what he was reading, looked up over his glasses, first at me, and then, slowly, at my mother. I watched her face turn. I'm not going to pretend I didn't watch it, because I'd waited my whole life to be seen. And for one moment the entire room saw the truth and saw her at the same time. The color went out of her face and then came back wrong, blotched, and her mouth opened and the church voice wasn't there anymore. What came out was small. He meant for me to manage those. I'm her mother. And Brother Ames, gentle as ever, said the thing that ended it. He set the certificate down softly and he said, "Diane, it's got her name on it. Walter typed it himself. I'd know his way of doing a thing anywhere." Walter typed it himself. The whole room understood. There is no arguing with a dead man's own handwriting read out by a deacon in a church hall. She had cashed 7 of them. The certificate named the owner of all of them. And every person who'd loved Walter now knew that the dutiful daughter in the good black dress had walked into a bank during the worst week of my life and lied at a counter to take what her father spent 18 years making sure couldn't be taken. She didn't make it loud. I didn't have to. The record did it for me. I'm not going to sell you a fairy tale about what came after, because the truth is better than a fairy tale, and I promised you the whole way through. My mother left the repast early. She gathered her purse with her hand shaking, and she went out to her car, and a couple of the church women watched her go, with a look I'd never seen aimed at her before. Not cruelty, just the quiet adjustment of people revising a person they thought they knew. Nobody chased her. Nobody made a scene. And the consequences of that one read-out line rippled out through that congregation slower and surer than any shouting could have. The first ripple was Hollis, the neighbor with the mower. He came over to my table before the coffee was even cold, and he stood there turning his cap in his hands, and he said, "I bought back as many of Walter's tools off that yard sale as I could carry. The wrenches, the bench, the can of pins. I had a feeling they ought to stay with someone who'd want them. They're in my shed. They're yours whenever you come." And I had not cried once all day, not at the casket, not at the certificate, but I cried then, at a man in a cap returning a coffee can of cotter pins, because that's where Walter's kindness had been hiding all along, in the people he'd been good to, holding the line for him when his own daughter wouldn't. The second ripple was the cousin from the bank, the one who'd told me about the counter without knowing what she was telling. She found me by the door, and she went white when she put it together, and she said, "I told you that like it was nothing. I'm so sorry. I'll tell the branch manager what really happened if you ever need me to." She didn't know she'd handed me the first thread. Now she was offering to pull it. I told her she might be needed, and I thanked her, and I meant it. And the third ripple was Marlene. She didn't come to me at the hall. She couldn't, not with Diane's car still in the lot, not yet. But she found my eyes across the room one more time, before I left, and she gave me the smallest nod, and in it was an apology for a phone call and a promise about something I didn't understand yet. I'll get to what she did 3 weeks later. It changes things. Here's the boundary I set, and I set it on purpose, because this was never about burning her down. I had a lawyer send my mother one letter. Not a lawsuit splashed across the family. One letter. It laid out, plainly, that the bonds were registered solely in my name, that cashing them constituted taking funds that were legally mine, and that she had 2 choices: repay the value of the 7 bonds she'd cashed on a schedule she could actually meet, or have the matter handled by people who do not use church voices. She chose to repay. She's repaying still, a little every month, and every month that payment is a small, quiet sentence that says, "It was hers." I never sent her to anything worse, though I could have. I didn't make a scene. I made it documented. I made it a door. And I did one more thing, and this is the part I'm proudest of. I did not cash those bonds for myself either. I took the ones that were left, the ones she hadn't gotten to, and I cashed exactly enough to set up a small fund at a bank in Walter's name, a few $100s a year, every year, given to one kid at his old high school who's good with their hands and short on a floor to stand on, because that's what the bonds were. He told me himself, "This is so you've always got a floor under you." Now, there's a floor under a stranger every year, with his name on it, and that is the only revenge I have ever wanted, to make his kindness outlive the woman who tried to cash it out. So, pull your chair back from the table with me for a second, because we're near the end now, and I want to give you the quiet part. I think about that little gray box on the top shelf of the garage. I think about a man buying an eagle on a piece of paper for a 4-year-old and typing her name into a box with the United States government as his witness, 18 years before he'd need it to mean anything, just so that someday, in some room he'd never see, nobody could talk her out of being loved by him. He couldn't have known about the church hall. He just knew his daughter, and he knew the world, and he did it right. In writing, because love that's only spoken can be edited, and love that's written down has to be read out loud. I will always know where you are, kiddo. He found a way to keep that promise from inside the ground. Doors, not walls. That's what I keep coming back to on the nights the house is too quiet. I didn't burn my mother's life down, even though the certificate would have let me. I closed a door, firmly, with a lock on it, with a lawyer's letter and a repayment schedule, and I walked through to the other side of it, where my grandfather's kindness gets to keep being true. A wall would have been about her. The door was about him, and about me, and about the kid at his old school who'll never know my name. That's the difference, and it's everything. And I want to close the one thread I left open, because I promised you I would, and because it's the part that still keeps me up some nights. My Aunt Marlene, who almost backed her sister, who was so tired she nearly let the lie stand, and who chose, in the last second, to speak for a dead man instead of a living one. She called me 3 weeks after the funeral. She was crying again, but it was a different crying. She said, "I have to tell you something, and I should have told you the day he died, and I didn't because I was a coward." And she told me that years ago, before the fog, Walter had brought a second metal box to her house. Not the gray one from the garage, a different one, and asked her to keep it somewhere Diane would never think to look, and to give it to me, only me, if anything ever happened that made the first box not enough. He said you'd know when it was enough, Marlene told me. He said, "Marlene, my granddaughter doesn't keep all her eggs in one nest." I taught her that. I sat down on my kitchen floor with the phone against my ear. He'd planned it twice. He'd armed me twice, and I'd only found the first. But what's inside that second box, what Walter hid at his quiet daughter's house, the thing he thought I might one day need even more than a certificate, that's a whole other story. And it changes how I see every single thing I just told you. But that one keeps till next time. So tell me, before you go, was she right that she should have managed it, or was a name typed in writing the last word? I read every comment, and I sit with them on the quiet nights. For now, thank you for sitting with me. Leave the porch light on for somebody tonight, and I'll see you on the next quiet night, kiddo. I'll always know where you are.